December 1944. Dawn breaks slowly over the frozen hills of Belgium. German tank crews stand in the snow, breath hanging in the air, binoculars pressed to their eyes. In the distance, barely visible through the morning haze, a river cuts across the landscape. The Meuse, 4 miles away. They can see it. They can see the bridges. They can see what victory looks like. But their engines are silent. Inside the steel hulls of the most powerful tanks ever built, fuel gauges sit hard against empty. No roar, no movement, only cold metal and frozen men. For days, these columns had smashed through American lines, scattering exhausted units, overrunning towns that were never meant to be defended. They were supposed to be unstoppable. Now they are motionless. No enemy fire pins them here. No American tanks block their path. No artillery barrage forces them to halt. They have simply run out of fuel. In that quiet moment, as the winter sun rises over the Ardennes, one question hangs over the battlefield. How did the most powerful armored offensive Germany ever launch die, 4 miles from victory? In December 1944, the Ardennes was not supposed to matter. American generals had labeled it a quiet sector, a place of rest, a stretch of forest and narrow roads considered unsuitable for large-scale armored warfare. Units sent here were told the same thing again and again. The Germans were finished. Their armies were exhausted. They no longer had the strength for a major offensive. So the Ardennes became a holding area for worn-down divisions and inexperienced replacements. Quartermaster clerks, truck drivers, infantry units pulled off the line to recover from weeks of brutal fighting in the Hurtgen forest, young men who had never faced enemy tanks. They dug foxholes in frozen ground and watched snow fall through tall pine trees. Some joked that this was the safest place in Europe. Behind them, supply depots quietly moved millions of gallons of gasoline every week, fueling the Allied advance toward Germany. Fuel was everywhere. It flowed so reliably that few gave it much thought. What American intelligence did not see was what the Germans were hiding just beyond the tree line. Under strict radio silence, entire divisions moved only at night. Tanks were concealed beneath forest canopies. Columns waited in frozen villages, engines cold, crews sleeping beside their vehicles. Nearly 200,000 German soldiers were gathering for one last gamble. The Ardennes was not quiet. It was simply blind. At dawn on December 16th, the silence shattered. German artillery erupted along an 85-mile front. The forest exploded into flame and splintered wood. Bunkers collapsed. Communication lines vanished under the barrage. Men who had been told they were safe now crouched in foxholes, stunned by the realization that the war had found them again. And when the shelling finally lifted, a deeper sound rolled out of the trees. Heavy engines. Steel tracks. German panzers moving forward. The quiet sector was gone. At the tip of the German advance stood a single battle group, Kampfgruppe Peiper. It was built for speed, shock, and terror. A reinforced column drawn from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Hitler's former bodyguard unit, now reshaped into an elite armored force. Its commander was 29 years old, Joachim Peiper. To the men under him, he was a symbol of ruthless momentum. On the Eastern Front, he had earned a reputation for relentless attacks and absolute indifference to anything that slowed his advance. Villages burned. Enemy units were crushed or bypassed. Orders were simple: move forward. Now Peiper had been chosen to lead the spearhead of Hitler's last offensive in the West. His column stretched for miles along the narrow Ardennes roads, hundreds of vehicles, thousands of men, and at its core, the most feared tanks in the German arsenal, the Tiger II. 70 tons of steel, armor so thick American tank guns could barely scratch it, an 88mm cannon that could destroy a Sherman from more than 2 miles away. To Allied soldiers, it was known as the King Tiger, a machine that seemed invincible. But power came at a price. The Tiger II was massive, over-engineered, and brutally inefficient, its engine strained to move its weight. On good roads, it consumed fuel at an alarming rate. Off-road, in snow and mud, consumption doubled or worse. A single Tiger II could drain its internal tanks in just a few hours of combat movement. Peiper knew this. Before the offensive even began, German logisticians had done the math. There was not enough fuel to reach the Meuse River, not even close. The plan depended on capturing American fuel depots along the way. If those depots fell intact, the offensive could continue. If they did not, the spearhead would die where it stood. Peiper accepted the risk without hesitation. Speed would solve everything. Delay would destroy everything. On the morning of December 16th, as German artillery thundered across the Ardennes, Peiper climbed into his command vehicle. Ahead of him lay narrow roads, untested bridges, and a timetable that allowed no mistakes. Behind him rolled the most powerful armored force Germany could still field, and beneath every tank, hidden from view, ticked the same invisible clock: fuel. The German plan depended on speed. Not tomorrow, not after consolidation, now. Peiper's column was supposed to surge west the moment the infantry cracked the American line. The panzers would pour through the gaps and never slow down. Instead, they stopped almost immediately. The Ardennes roads were not roads at all. They were farm tracks, logging paths, narrow ribbons of frozen mud twisting through dense forest. In places, 2 vehicles could not pass. If one tank stalled, the entire column behind it froze in place. Traffic jams formed before noon on the first day. Infantry, horse-drawn artillery, supply trucks, and armored vehicles collided in chaos. Orders conflicted. Maps proved useless. A single broken bridge could halt miles of armor. At one crossing, a railway overpass sagged under the weight of the first Tiger II. Engineers worked frantically to reinforce it, while the column idled, engines running, fuel burning away minute by minute. There was no room to turn around, no room to bypass, only forward or nothing. Every delay was invisible to the Americans, but devastating to the Germans. Engines burned fuel just to stay warm. Drivers kept motors running to avoid freezing. Tanks consumed gasoline without moving an inch. By the time Peiper's lead vehicles finally pushed through the bottleneck, precious hours were gone. The timetable was already broken. The element of surprise was slipping away. And while German tanks sat motionless in the forest, American commanders were waking up to the scale of the attack. Orders flew. Reinforcements rolled south. Airborne divisions loaded onto trucks. The window was closing. The roads of the Ardennes were doing what American firepower had not yet managed. They were killing momentum. The German timetable assumed one thing above all else, that the Americans would break. They were expected to retreat, surrender, or scatter under the weight of armor and artillery. That was how blitzkrieg worked. That was how it had always worked. But in the Ardennes, something unexpected happened. Small groups of American soldiers stayed where they were. At crossroads, on ridgelines, in villages no one thought mattered, scattered units refused to move. They had no tanks, little artillery, often no clear orders. What they had was time, and they spent it with their lives. Near the village of Lanzerath, just 18 American soldiers from a reconnaissance platoon took up positions along a forested ridge. They were supposed to observe, not fight. When German paratroopers advanced, the Americans opened fire anyway. For nearly an entire day, those 18 men held off a force hundreds strong. They shifted positions, rationed ammunition, and kept firing long after they should have been overrun. Every hour they held was an hour Peiper could not advance. All across the front, similar scenes unfolded, roadblocks made from overturned trucks, machine gun teams firing until barrels glowed, infantry squads delaying armored columns by forcing them to deploy, halt, and detour. These were not decisive victories. They were acts of denial. The Germans pushed forward, but never fast enough. Every delay burned fuel. Every firefight forced engines to idle. Every detour drained tanks meant to be full at the Meuse. By the time Peiper's lead elements broke through these scattered defenses, the cost was already unbearable. The Americans were not trying to stop the offensive. They were buying time, and time was the one resource Peiper could not replace. On the morning of December 17th, Peiper finally reached something he desperately needed: fuel. Near the town of Bulge, German scouts reported an American supply area. Nothing massive, no sprawling depot, but gasoline. As Peiper's tanks rolled in, the scene bordered on the unreal. American supply troops, caught completely off guard, fled or surrendered as armored vehicles thundered past. Jerry cans were stacked in neat rows. Fuel trucks sat abandoned, engines cold. German tank crews jumped down from their vehicles and went to work immediately. American prisoners were forced to help. Hoses were dragged out. Caps were opened. Gasoline poured into tanks that had been running on fumes. For the first time since the offensive began, Peiper's spearhead could breathe. But the relief was an illusion. The fuel at Bulge amounted to roughly 50,000 gallons, enough to move, enough to delay collapse, not enough to finish the job. Peiper's battle group consumed nearly that amount, simply advancing a few dozen miles. Every Tiger II burned fuel faster than it could be replaced. Every kilometer west erased the gains made at Bulge. Peiper knew the numbers. This fuel did not solve the problem. It only postponed it. The real prize lay farther ahead. Much farther. According to German intelligence, massive American fuel depots waited near Stavelot and Spa. Millions of gallons, enough to reach the Meuse, enough to change everything. So the column moved again. Engines roared back to life, tracks clawed into frozen roads, and with every mile, the tanks grew thirsty once more. Shortly after noon on December 17th, Peiper's spearhead reached a crossroads south of the town of Malmedy. Here, the German column encountered an American convoy moving east, artillery observers, technicians, men not meant to fight tanks. The clash was brief and uneven. German armor and infantry swept in. A few Americans were killed in the confusion. The rest surrendered. They were gathered in a snow-covered field near the crossroads, unarmed, cold, waiting. What happened next would echo across the Ardennes. German machine guns opened fire. Men fell where they stood. Others ran and were cut down in the snow. Some lay still, pretending to be dead, as bullets tore through the bodies around them. When the firing stopped, SS soldiers walked among the wounded and shot those who moved. 84 American prisoners were killed. A handful survived by hiding among the dead or escaping into the woods. They carried the news back to American lines. Within hours, word spread through every unit in the Ardennes. No mercy. The massacre did not terrify American soldiers into retreat. It hardened them. Orders were passed quietly. SS units would not be taken lightly. Resistance would be absolute. Peiper pushed on, unaware that the road behind him had just changed. From that moment forward, the Americans were no longer delaying out of confusion. They were fighting with purpose. By the evening of December 17th, Peiper's objective had shifted. It was no longer just speed, it was fuel. German intelligence pointed west toward the town of Stavelot. Just beyond it, hidden among forest roads and small river crossings, lay something far more valuable than bridges or towns. American fuel, not thousands of gallons, millions. If Peiper could seize those depots intact, his battle group would live. The drive to the Meuse could continue. Antwerp would remain possible. If he failed, everything would end where it stood. As darkness fell, Peiper's column approached the outskirts of Stavelot. The tanks had been moving almost constantly for 2 days. Crews were exhausted. Engines were running hot. Fuel gauges were dropping again. The prudent choice would have been to attack immediately. Seize the crossings. Push through before the Americans could react. Instead, Peiper halted. The men needed rest. The vehicles needed assessment. The fuel situation was unclear. So the German spearhead stopped for the night. Those few hours would decide the fate of the offensive. While Peiper's tanks sat in the cold, American officers in Stavelot understood exactly what was at stake. They did not have tanks to stop him. They did not have enough men. But they had something else: time. And they knew how to destroy what Peiper needed most. The men who now stood between Peiper and his fuel were not tankers. They were engineers. Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin commanded the American units responsible for the roads, bridges, and river crossings around Stavelot. His soldiers were trained to build, to repair, to clear obstacles. They were not meant to stop 70-ton tanks, but they understood one thing perfectly: how to destroy. As reports of the German breakthrough arrived, Pergrin reacted immediately. Orders went out through the night. Roads were mined. Trees were felled across narrow approaches. Bridges were wired with explosives. Every crossing became a trap. The goal was simple: not to defeat the German armor, only to slow it. Engineers worked by flashlight in freezing darkness, stringing detonation cord, stacking charges, calculating how long they could wait before firing. They knew the tanks were coming. They could hear them in the distance. For Peiper, every bridge now posed the same question: cross quickly and risk demolition beneath his tracks, or halt and search for another route. Either choice burned fuel. Every delay multiplied the damage already done by the Ardennes roads. Every detour consumed gasoline that could never be replaced. This was no longer a tank battle. It was an engineers' war, and the Germans were losing it without firing a shot. Just before dawn on December 18th, the Americans made their choice. They would not try to save the fuel. They would destroy it. As Peiper's lead elements edged toward Stavelot, American engineers and supply troops moved through the depots along the Amblève River. Valves were opened, hoses cut loose. Gasoline spilled across frozen ground and into the water below. Then the fires were lit. Flames surged skyward, rolling black smoke into the morning air. The river itself burned, sheets of fire drifting downstream, lighting the valley in orange and red. From a distance, German crews saw only one thing: inferno. To Peiper, it looked like the Americans were destroying fuel he could never reach, that the depots were already lost. What he could not see was what lay just beyond the smoke: fuel stores that had not been ignited, tanks hidden behind buildings, thousands upon thousands of gallons still intact. The fire did exactly what the engineers had intended. It deceived. Believing Stavelot to be a dead end, Peiper diverted his column away from the river valley, searching for another crossing. Each turn burned more fuel. Each delay narrowed his options. The most valuable prize of the entire offensive sat behind him, untouched, and he never knew it. After the war, American officers walked the ground Peiper had abandoned. What they found was staggering. Less than 500 yards from the route his column had taken stood intact fuel stores, hidden behind buildings, shielded by terrain, left untouched in the chaos of the retreat. Enough gasoline to refuel his tanks, enough to push to the Meuse, enough to keep the offensive alive. Peiper never knew they were there. German intelligence had failed. Maps were outdated. Reports were incomplete. The smoke at Stavelot had convinced him that everything of value was already gone. So he turned away. With that single decision, the last real chance of success vanished. From that moment on, Peiper's battle group was living on borrowed time. Fuel trucks could not reach him. The Luftwaffe could not deliver enough by air. The roads behind him were collapsing under American counterattacks. Each hour brought the same reality. Engines could not be run. Tanks could not maneuver. Even retreat was becoming impossible. The German offensive had not been stopped by firepower. It had not been defeated in a decisive battle. It had been undone by ignorance. Victory had been missed by a few hundred yards. After Stavelot, the ground itself turned against Peiper. Every bridge he approached was either gone or about to be. American engineers waited until the last possible second. They let German lead vehicles come into view. They listened to engines echo across the valleys. Then they fired the charges. Bridges collapsed into icy rivers, steel twisted, stone shattered, entire routes vanished in clouds of smoke and debris. Each destroyed crossing forced Peiper to make the same choice again: stop and wait for engineers who lacked fuel and equipment, or turn away and search for another route through unfamiliar terrain. Every option was worse than the last. Detours added miles. Miles burned fuel. Fuel no longer existed. The Kampfgruppe began to fragment. Vehicles were abandoned not because they were damaged, but because they could no longer move. By the time Peiper reached La Glaise, his spearhead was no longer a spear. It was a pocket, surrounded, running dry, and cut off from everything it needed to survive. The offensive was still moving on maps in Berlin, but here, in the Ardennes, it was already over. By December 20th, the silence around Peiper's column was complete. Not the silence of peace, the silence of machines that could no longer move. Tanks sat where they had stopped, engines dead, fuel tanks dry. Crews drained the last drops from jerry cans and poured them into vehicles that still refused to start. There would be no resupply. German transport columns were blocked far to the east. American artillery dominated the roads. Airdrops attempted in desperation scattered uselessly into the forests or fell into American hands. One plan remained: fuel by river. Engineers attempted to pump gasoline upstream along the Amblev, forcing it against the current toward Peiper's position. It was a fantasy. The cold thickened the fuel. The current carried it away. Nothing reached the waiting tanks. The most feared armored force in Western Europe was now helpless. American units tightened the ring. Infantry moved closer. Artillery zeroed in on known positions. The Tigers could still fire. They could still kill. But they could not move. And a tank that cannot move is already dead. On the night of December 23rd, Joachim Peiper made his final decision. The tanks would be abandoned. Explosives were placed inside the Tigers and Panthers. Guns were destroyed. Radios smashed. Anything that could not be carried was rendered useless. The men gathered quietly in the snow. No engines, no lights, no speeches. Only the sound of wind moving through the trees. Shortly before midnight, the breakout began. Peiper led roughly 800 survivors eastward, slipping through American lines on foot. They moved in small groups, avoiding roads, wading through icy streams, carrying the wounded as best they could. Behind them, the greatest armored concentration Germany had fielded in the West burned in the darkness. Dozens of Tiger II tanks, machines meant to dominate battlefields, were left as silent wrecks in the forest. By Christmas Eve, Peiper and a fraction of his men reached German lines. The rest were dead, wounded, or captured. The spearhead was gone. Not defeated in battle, not destroyed by tanks, it had simply run out of fuel. When the fighting in the Ardennes finally slowed, the battlefield told a strange story. Dozens of German tanks sat intact, abandoned where they had last stopped, their armor unbroken, their guns still capable of killing. They had not been destroyed. They had been denied. The Battle of the Bulge would go down in history as Germany's last great offensive in the West, a desperate gamble, a final attempt to change the course of the war, but its failure was not decided by tank, duels, or dramatic last stands. It was decided by roads too narrow, bridges that vanished at the right moment, and engineers who understood exactly what to destroy. It was decided by American infantry who refused to move, not to win, but to delay. By supply officers who set fire to millions of gallons of their own fuel rather than let it fall into enemy hands. And by a simple truth of modern war. An army does not advance on courage alone. It advances on fuel. 4 miles from the Meuse, the most powerful armored force Germany could assemble ran out of it. The tanks fell silent. The offensive died. If this story was worth remembering, take a moment to reflect on the quiet battles that decide wars long before the shooting stops.